Hello? Oh, yes. Thank you. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm so honored to be here speaking with you today. I'm very excited to see the number of people in this room, and just over the past couple of days, is it better? Here. Just in the past couple of days, talking to a lot of the people in and out of these rooms, I'm excited that we're have the ability to talk about some of these things today. So I'm wearing two hats today. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Florida. I study autoimmune diseases, but I'm also a person with narcolepsy. More specifically, I'm a gluten-free person with narcolepsy, and I'm a member of a very highly active Facebook group called Gluten-free PWN. And I'm going to talk to you today about improving narcolepsy symptoms with dietary changes. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about gluten-free specifically, but more towards the end of the talk, I'm going to touch on some of the other dietary changes that a lot of people in our groups report that they find that helps their symptoms. So I have a disclaimer to give. I don't receive any financial compensation from any of the programs. I'm going to link to a few very specific blogs and websites and books that people have written. I don't receive any compensation or anything from these programs. I simply think they're very helpful resources. Most importantly, I'm not a clinician. I don't see patients or treat patients. So any medical decisions that you make, please make that a conversation with your doctor. The other thing I want to point out is I've been tweeting updates as people have been giving their talks, and I know some other people are doing that. I want to make it very clear before we start the talk that I don't think that dietary changes can cure narcolepsy, even though I've seen myself, and we have members in our group that see a lot of dietary changes and they see improvements in their symptoms. Very few, and I think almost no people now use the terminology cure. We all still have symptoms of narcolepsy. Most of the times they are just very mildly or sometimes moderately and occasionally greatly reduced using dietary changes, usually in combination with medications. So I want to start out a little bit of who I am. Like many of you in the room, I started having symptoms of narcolepsy from a very young age, although for me they didn't become very bad until I reached sort of the high school, college age. I became quite unfunctional in college, and I was diagnosed right in the middle of college with narcolepsy. I think it's a very important part of my own story. Certainly in the groups that I've been involved in, it seems to be much more common than we tend to talk about, but this idea that people often have things other than narcolepsy, and this is very much true for my own personal story. So around a 1 to 2 year period where when I was obtaining a narcolepsy diagnosis, I was also diagnosed with autoimmune thyroid disease. I also have autoimmune skin conditions. I was diagnosed with IBS. I gained a lot of weight, like many people with narcolepsy, and I was also diagnosed with a mood disorder, as you know, is quite common among people with narcolepsy, whether it's a true mood disorder or it's a misdiagnosis that later becomes an inaccurate diagnosis of narcolepsy. So I was having such a myriad of health problems that I began researching a link between diet and inflammation and autoimmune disease. And I was very lucky under two regards. One, I had a very good primary care physician that that strongly advocated food rotation diets. And the other thing was I had a very good sleep specialist who also strongly advocates the use of grain-free diets in narcolepsy. And so all of these things came together for me, and I went on a food rotation diet. And I expected that when I got to the gluten-free part of the rotation diet, that probably some of my intestinal symptoms would go away. I'd been Googling and researching a little bit. I had headaches, and I thought maybe those would at least mitigate on a gluten-free diet. About a month after I went gluten-free, I was totally astonished when a lot of my narcolepsy symptoms became very, very diminished. I then started looking around online for other people who were talking about this kind of phenomenon, and I was totally blown away when I was reading all the blogs and forums of at least several other people at that time that had began using a gluten-free diet and noticed symptom improvements. So I want to jump forward a few years post my diagnosis. Now, as like I said, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Florida, and I study autoimmune diseases. Specifically, I'm an intestinal immunologist. So for those of you who might not know, your immune system is kind of like soldiers in an army. And so normally and in health, these soldiers protect you from foreign invasion and they fight against disease. Every once in a while, and for some people, these soldiers can start committing acts of treason. And so they begin attacking kind of apparently healthy cells and tissues within your own body. So when these soldiers begin committing acts of treason, we call it an autoimmune disease. So my project specifically focuses on how intestinal inflammation can drive autoimmune diseases, because we know that for most autoimmune diseases, there's a very strong environmental component. So while we know that you have to have a genetic susceptibility to getting an autoimmune disease eventually, there's a requirement in most autoimmune diseases for an interaction with your environment, which is not just what's around you, but we also consider what's on the inside of your digestive tract as part of your environment, because it's continuous with the environment. So this environmental trigger idea in autoimmune diseases also includes chronic infections that could be of your airway or your gut, and also include dietary things that you eat, as well as some other things. So in addition to my graduate research, I'm also very active in communicating science, and I'm very passionate about educating the public on some things that we know. I think sometimes we get people that are very well educated, but because they lack a scientific background, sometimes things get lost in translation. And so I feel that it's very important that as scientists and as clinicians, that we become more open and more excited about communicating some of our research to the public. And so I do this in a variety of forums, and I have a few websites and places that I submit to. And I link a lot of what I do in what I'm blogging. I link what I know professionally, what I experience professionally, and I relate it to a lot of what I've lived through in my own experience. So again, I said that we know that autoimmune diseases arise on genetically susceptible backgrounds. So these are just genes that you inherit from your mom and your dad. And I researched specifically autoimmune diabetes, and this is an autoimmune disease of the pancreas. And so we know that there are genes that are highly involved that regulate the way that your immune system functions. And for those of you who went to Dr. Swift's talk, you'll be familiar with this little HLA cluster here. This is very, very commonly associated with progression and susceptibilities to autoimmune disease. So these affect the way that your immune system functions, and for most autoimmune diseases, and certainly for type 1 diabetes, we know that an environmental interaction, both on the background of whatever your genetics are, what you're susceptible to, as well as the way that your immune system functions, are critical for driving disease. These are very well described in type 1 diabetes particularly. So we know that viral infections are very common triggers, especially in early childhood, of whether or not someone will progress to type 1 diabetes and how quickly they can progress to type 1 diabetes. There's another form of autoimmune diabetes that is highly associated with a viral trigger, and will get diabetes almost right after that viral infection. What's also known is that we have dietary triggers, and so the two dietary triggers that we see very commonly in type 1 diabetes are reactions to the protein that's found in wheat, which is gluten, and the protein that's found in milk, and that's in casein. And so there's some evidence that introducing these into a child's diet, the timing is critically important. So if you do it too early, you might precipitate some autoimmunity that they may be predisposed to form. But also, if you introduce it too late, they also might progress. And so the timing of introduction of dietary food things are very important. So I'm personally interested in how all of these three things come together in narcolepsy. We've talked, and you've heard here, that narcolepsy is not an autoimmune disease yet, right? We don't classify it, and we don't really have enough evidence that it is a true classical autoimmune disease. However, it shares many features of autoimmune diseases that we know do exist, and I think the general feeling is that we're working towards understanding the autoimmune nature of narcolepsy. So we know that it's highly associated with an HLA subclass that predisposes your immune system to react in a certain way. And we also now know that there are environmental triggers that are very important. So we've been talking a lot the past couple of years. It really started with the H1N1 vaccines, and then we started talking about seasonal flu affecting it. You heard a presenter yesterday talk about the 1918 flu pandemic that was highly associated. And so viral infections are very common. What's also in the literature are associations with streptococcal and bacterial infections. And so whether these occur together or whether a streptococcal infection makes you more susceptible to viral infection is still being worked out in the literature. What's not known is whether or not we can have dietary triggers in narcolepsy. And so I'm going to leave it really there for now and just say that that's something that I feel that we should at least consider looking at. So I want to talk more about the environment and how you interact with your environment. So this is a very, 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 very zoomed in picture of your intestine. And what you can see is here on the outside, and we have environment, and I told you that was not only the things out here, right, but that's also the food that you're eating or the commensal bacteria, for example, that are in your body. And so we call this the environmental interface. The intestine is quite unique in that because it has these little structures that are called villi, we increase the surface area substantially for this environmental interface to take place. So your intestine is the largest environmental interface of the human body, and in an average adult, it's a 400 square meter interface. And I'm not very good with numbers, I'm good with pictures, and so for those of you who might not know how big this is, that's the size of a tennis court. So this is a size of a tennis court for your body to interact with the environment. What I find also quite intriguing is that the intestine is unique as sort of a skin-type surface, and that this interface is mediated by a single layer of epithelial cells. So this is one cell layer thick. You learned probably in your textbooks, and I certainly learned, that your intestine was really, can you absorb nutrients? Its purpose is to absorb nutrients. What we've appreciated more recently is that the intestine actually has very critical functions in sensing the environment properly, and it drives a lot of the tuning of the immune cells within your own body. So these cells communicate to your immune system. It tells the immune system what it sees about the environment, and in health or in absence of infection, these cues send a signal of anti-inflammation. Everything's okay here, nothing's going on, nothing to be worried about, and it promotes what we call local tolerance, and this is the absence of a reaction to either the bacteria in your gut or the food that you're eating, for example. And we know that this sensing mechanism is extremely important for local tolerance, and now we appreciate that it's also important for tolerance all around your body, not just in your gut. So in the case of an infection, or if you have inflammatory foods, and I will also add the caveat of if your body thinks they are inflammatory, you get this idea that there's still you have this environmental sensing mechanism, but now it's communicating to the host immune system that this is inflammatory. There's something dangerous in the environment. There's something that's either a pathogenic bacteria, for example, maybe a viral infection, and it's going to drive, and it breaks tolerance. So this is something that's being worked out in the scientific literature now, but we know that this kind of chronic inflammation cascade definitely breaks tolerance locally. Whether or not it can break tolerance peripherally, we're accumulating evidence for. So we think that this tolerance mechanism and breaking tolerance can drive some peripheral autoimmune diseases. This whole phenomenon is called leaky gut. So when you have this condition of inflammation, the spaces between these cells increase, and it allows for the passage of the bacteria or food or whatever between the cells so that it can interact with your immune system, so your immune system can eliminate it more quickly. I do also want to highlight that there are two usages of the word leaky gut. One is a very technical term that we use in the intestinal immunology field, and it literally just means the spaces between these cells and the loosening of the spaces between those cells. There's another term called leaky gut syndrome, where if you Google leaky gut, you'll find a lot of it, and those are kind of related but separate things. Leaky gut, in terms of this intracellular barrier, is scientifically defined. Just a couple of weeks ago, there was a really nice paper that looked at a mouse model for multiple sclerosis, which is another autoimmune disease, and they showed that just by transferring the cells that were responsible for autoimmunity into a mouse that did not have autoimmunity, it induced a leaky gut and it increased their permeability in this layer. So whether or not this is a cause or consequence of disease, we have to work out in the literature. So this is why we're all here, and I promise that's the most science. We're going to take it pretty light from here. So can diet changes actually improve narcolepsy symptoms? So around the time that I had started doing my research, I found one paper. Many of you may be familiar with it, because to my knowledge, it's the only paper with this very specific title, and it's called Dietary Therapy for Narcolepsy. And to my knowledge, this is the first report of dietary changes really improving narcolepsy symptoms. What they did was they put their patients on a low-carbohydrate ketogenic diet, what you probably colloquially know as this Atkins-type diet. And so when they put these patients on an Atkins diet, they noticed significant but pretty modest improvements. They also had a really hard time here with adherence to the diet. And this is something that I think is worth pointing out, because just in talking with people within the narcolepsy community, it seems to be very difficult for people to go on a low-carb diet, because we tend to gravitate towards high-carbohydrate foods that keep us awake and give us short amounts of energy. But nonetheless, this really inspired people with narcolepsy to begin attempting some diet changes to try and improve their symptoms. And eventually, we started talking online a little bit. We started getting on blogs. A few of us made our own blogs, and we were just trying to connect with other people. What worked for you? What didn't work for you? This is what I did. That's crazy. I did the same thing. Oh my gosh. And so eventually we grew to a very highly active Facebook group. And when I first came onto the group, I didn't start the group, but I first came onto it, I think about 2.5 years ago, and at that time we had probably 20 to 30 members, and so just yesterday we hit the 426 mark, and I hope many of you will join us after this talk. We started the group, as our name implies, being very specifically gluten-free. Over time, we have morphed into not just gluten-free, but we now define ourselves as a group of people interested in reducing narcolepsy symptoms with dietary changes, period. So we spend a lot of time talking about gluten-free, because most of our members attempt a gluten-free diet or do a gluten-free diet. We spend a lot of time talking about low-carb diets, dairy-free diets. Somebody does a corn-free diet. And so we're very inclusive in that regard. So I'm going to focus the first part of this section on a gluten-free diet, because that is the most common that people adopt. I'm going to transition into talking more about some of the other diets that we see people in our group adopting, and I'm just going to do kind of a one slide on each of those. So I know probably most of you are familiar with a gluten-free diet. When I first started a gluten-free diet, nobody really knew what it was. And I remember very specifically, I tried to order something. I said, well, I can't have bread. And he goes, oh, no, it's okay. It's whole wheat bread. And it seems to be kind of a common experience, but there's been a lot of awareness, I think, in the past few years. Gluten-free is kind of a fad diet. But for those of you who aren't familiar, gluten is actually the protein, or a cluster of proteins that are found in wheat and also related species of grains, so barley, rye, and a couple of others that aren't common in the United States anyway, but all of the foods that are made with them, and so this includes wheat flour, cookies, pizza bread, beer, pasta, also soy sauce is wheat, very critical, and I put this little clip up here because I remember the first year before I went gluten-free, I think I was only eating pasta and Chinese takeout, which maybe was part of the problem. But it took me actually 6 months of practicing a gluten-free diet before I was able to get it right, because I very much loved bread. I loved eating bread, and I still dream about bread even though it's been 6 years. So what does it mean when you have a sensitivity to gluten? And the sensitivities to gluten now fall under a sort of spectrum of diseases that we call gluten-related disorders. I'm going to focus on 2 of these, but the first that you can get is really this true allergy. So if you're allergic to it, you break out in hives. These are really hard to miss. And we're not going to talk about that today. I'm going to focus rather on this autoimmune form and this innate form of a gluten-related disorder. So the autoimmune form is probably the one you're most familiar with. This is largely falls under celiac disease, although there can be a couple of other manifestations. So celiac disease is this autoimmune form of gluten sensitivity. It causes really severe intestinal damage. We're now appreciating that there are some other symptoms that can occur, but intestinal damage was the hallmark of celiac disease. Importantly, we can diagnose celiac disease with a biopsy. There is some pretty quick blood tests now that you can do in a doctor's office. So this gluten sensitivity really kind of, as you can see, falls under not autoimmune, and it's not allergy, and it falls under what we call innate inflammation. So this is a condition where you have an inflammatory reaction, and it's an innate type response, but it's in the absence of cells or cells of your immune system that are specific to wheat. So it's kind of a generalized inflammation. We call it innate inflammation. We know that many times these symptoms are beyond intestinal symptoms. So people do report having intestinal symptoms when they're diagnosed with gluten sensitivity, but the hallmark feature typically tends to be symptoms that are more like brain fog and fatigue and migraine and things like that. Very, very critically is that no blood tests can be done to test for gluten sensitivity, and currently the way that we diagnose is by doing an elimination diet. So despite what you may have read within the past couple of months on BuzzFeed, gluten sensitivity is actually a real disease. It's recently recognized, and it's a clinically distinct condition. It's really defined as the absence of celiac disease and the absence of wheat allergy, but your symptoms resolve on a gluten-free diet. And this has more recently been coupled with a few more stringent criteria where if you still have irritable bowel type syndromes, there are some other things that can fall in. If you're negative for all of those, then it's considered gluten sensitivity. I highlighted that there are symptoms that largely occur beyond the intestine, and this is not something that you typically associate with food that you're putting in your mouth and you're eating. Many of the symptoms that people report are neurological in nature. Typically, it's very non-specific. Brain fog, headache, auras are common, and things like that. And I can't say this enough times. There aren't any blood tests that we can do to diagnose non-celiac gluten intolerance. If you Google test for this, you will find that people are marketing specific blood tests that are quite expensive. to diagnose non-celiac gluten sensitivity as well as other food intolerances, and these are not clinically accepted tests. And so currently the only clinically accepted way that you can diagnose most of these is to undergo an elimination diet and a subsequent gluten challenge. So the symptoms, I wanted to put them kind of all up here just as a sort of checklist. These are similar to celiac disease. What's different in celiac disease is we see very clearly you get bloating, cramping, diarrhea. It occurs very young. You lose a lot of weight typically, although we know now that you can gain weight with true celiac disease. We know that you can also see many non-specific symptoms. Sleep disturbances, migraine, headache, joint pain, fatigue, anxiety are very common. And part of what makes kind of an accurate diagnosis of non-celiac gluten sensitivity difficult is that these are very non-specific symptoms. They share symptoms with most other autoimmune diseases, most chronic diseases, and so it becomes very difficult to just rule out that there aren't any underlying conditions and that it truly is a gluten sensitivity. I want to highlight again that it's very important that you discuss with your doctor before you make any medical changes, especially if you have symptoms of overt celiac disease. It's very important that you talk to your doctor because if you go on a gluten-free diet without doing that first, you can miss a diagnosis of celiac disease that you might have gotten otherwise. So I told you a lot about what you can't eat, and when I first started the gluten-free diet, I got extremely overwhelmed because I went to all the same places in the grocery store that I had been going, and I was reading the labels, and it was wheat, 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 wheat everywhere, and I had to throw away everything in my kitchen. And so what I try to do now is I try to focus on things that are naturally gluten-free, things that are inherently gluten-free, and especially when you're transitioning into the diet, I find it's much easier if you just go ahead and focus on the things that already don't have gluten and just eat as much as you want, I guess. So the things that are really inherently gluten-free are going to be meat, fish, hamburgers, anything like that. All fruits and vegetables are gluten-free, although I do want to make the caveat that corn is not a vegetable. Eggs, dairy, cheeses are all safe. And we also now have a lot of baking mixes, which I'm actually kind of excited about because we didn't have these when I first started, so I just gave up baking altogether because I'm an awful cook. But now we have a lot of substitutions that make it pretty easy. These tend to be pricey, but there are some ways that you can do it cost effectively. So in line with kind of focusing on what you can eat rather than what you can't, I drew this diagram and I told our group and I was like, hey guys, what do you think about this? Eating on the outside of the grocery store. And one of my friends in the group pointed out that it's not actually eating on the outside of the grocery store, it's eating on the perimeter of the grocery store. So in line with this, as long as you avoid a bakery, if you have a bakery in your local grocery store, you can pretty much hit all of your gluten-free items if you just kind of avoid around the aisles. And this is really how I shop now, and I even think the nutritionist yesterday mentioned something along these lines of just shopping kind of on the perimeter where a lot of the whole foods are. You avoid a lot of the processed foods. In addition to avoiding wheat specifically, you avoid all of the processed foods where even if they're gluten-free by themselves, they're processed on equipment that also contain wheat, and so they can not be gluten-free at that point. So I want to highlight something that's a little bit different than I heard Dr. Irisfeld talk a couple of years ago. I believe it was exactly 2 years ago at this conference, and she gave a really wonderful presentation on some environmental toxins and food allergies and how to do a food rotation diet. What's different about gluten-free and gluten sensitivity and adopting a gluten-free diet is that it's a different recommendation than most food rotation diets. So typical food rotation diets go on 3-day rotations where you eat one food and you rotate every 3 days. This is not enough for a gluten-free diet. So it's clinically recommended that you do at least 3 weeks of a very strict gluten-free diet to determine if there's an underlying gluten intolerance. It's not known why this is the case. We think that you can just continually react to the gluten that's there. It might also be that gluten, if you think about it, I mean, it's pizza dough, right? It makes extremely good bread. It's very sticky, and so there's this idea that maybe the transit time for gluten is a little bit longer than some other foods, and it might just take 3 weeks to clear your system. And again, I want to highlight the part of my story that I find relevant, and it's that it took me 6 months of practicing a gluten-free diet before I got it right. And this is very common in our groups and in people who adopt gluten-free diets. It's very difficult to do. It's especially very difficult to do the first time around. And I also consider myself lucky. I live in a single-person household, so I've also noticed that it's additionally difficult if you have other people to cook for, if you keep gluten in the house during this period. But don't worry, it's okay if this happens. It happens to everybody, but it's very, very critical that if something happens where you accidentally cheat or you really need a beer at the end of the day, that's fine, but you've got to start the 3-week timer over. And this really touches on a lot of this idea that reducing gluten is not enough. And I'm actually going to show you some survey data from a survey that we conducted a couple of months ago. And we don't know what the threshold responses for gluten are. So we know that for celiac disease, they can be as low as 10 parts per million. And we've had some recent changes in the way that we label food products so that we're more strict than we used to be. But we don't know what these responses are for this innate sensitivity to gluten. We don't know what the threshold is for those. So we have to do this strict adoption for at least that initial period because you can continually react to the wheat in the diet. And so this 3-week elimination is very critical, and then you undergo what's called a gluten challenge, where you reintroduce gluten and you identify whether or not it exacerbates any of your symptoms that you initially did the gluten-free diet for. So I polled our group and I asked if you had to do gluten-free over again, but you had a whole bunch of advice, what is the advice that you wish that you had when you first went gluten-free? So the first is to carefully read labels, and this is much easier to do than it was when I first started. We've had recent changes in some of the regulatory restrictions around the amount of gluten that's acceptable in foods, and so it's very easy to identify if a food has gluten in it, it will say very clearly on the bottom, contains wheat or something like that. Eating out or dining out is quite dangerous. So there are very, very few places where you can eat in a restaurant that are gluten-free. I've noticed there's an exception to this rule, and it's Denver, Colorado. I'm from the Southeast, and so I took pictures of I think every menu when we went out. It was very exciting. So a lot of chain restaurants, especially now, have gluten-free menus. They won't advertise them, so if you ask for them, you say, hey, can I have a gluten-free menu? Typically, they have some kind of book or something that says what all the allergens in the food are. Don't just take the bun off. This is very critical because it is different than how we normally think of going on diets. So we normally think of diets as reducing something or going low fat or trying to cut out most of your sugar. And we know that gluten is much different, right? So even because we don't know what the smallest amount that you can tolerate is, it's really important that at least for that initial transition period, you can't just take the bun off and then say it's gluten-free because it's not gluten-free anymore. It may be okay for you later on down the road and you might not be that sensitive, but at least for that initial period, it's really critical to be as strict as possible. Gluten likes to hide in very funny places, and I'll tell a little bit of an anecdotal story. I was dating someone and I kept getting sick, and I was like, gosh, why am I getting sick? And I realized it was because I was gluten-free, but the person was drinking a lot of beer. And so now I screen everybody, and I just ask if they're gluten-free. So it hides in very funny places, and some of the places that we have sort of talked about on our forum blogs and stuff like that is a couple of very specific places. One are dish sponges. So if you wash dishes with something that's had flour or something like that, it's in your dish sponge, and you're cleaning it with the other dishes. So putting your dishes in the dishwasher is quite advisable. The other thing that we've had a couple of our members do is they just get so frustrated because they realize they've been making gluten-free muffins in tins that used to have gluten in them, and now it's like baked on the side, or in cast iron is especially a problem. So we've had a couple of members just throw out all of their utensils and all of their cookware and just replace it all together, although that's kind of extreme. The other thing is that there's a lot of gluten-free resources now on the internet that we didn't have when we first started, and there's actually a lot more credible resources than when we first began because of the clinical awareness of it and things of that nature. So I have another disclaimer. The potential connection between specific food sensitivities and narcolepsy has not been scientifically investigated. So when we talk about improvements of using dietary changes in narcolepsy, these are either theoretical or they're anecdotal. There are other people with narcolepsy that say, hey, this works, and there's nothing in the scientific literature that would support any specific avoidance of foods, and I think that's very important to point out. In the Data Guide for Narcolepsy, written by Dr. Mignot, he does note that some people with narcolepsy find their symptoms improve when they make lifestyle changes, such as napping on schedule or avoiding specific foods, though these are rarely enough to control the problem. And that's very in line with what we see in our groups, and that we see people that do get some symptom relief occasionally and sometimes dramatic symptom relief, but most people are coupling it with standard medication. So we took a survey of people with narcolepsy, and we circulated this not only within our gluten-free group, but among the other groups on Facebook as well. And this was an anonymous survey, and we asked people about the dietary strategies that they adopted to help manage their symptoms. We collected 70 responses over a 3-week period, and because the gluten-free diet was the most common that people had tried, we focused on that diet, and we asked how strict people were and how much symptom relief they felt they had from a diet. So these are all the reported diets attempted. Because we already knew the demographic of the group, we gave them some options, but we also had a sort of fill in the blank where you can tell us any other ones that we had left out. The majority of these are gluten-free, as you see here. We also have low carbohydrate, ketogenic, sugar-free diets. We have some people who do dairy-free diets. And as well as paleo sort of Wall's protocol diets, and I'm going to talk more about that later. These are not mutually exclusive. 10 minutes? So I'm going to breeze through this. So when you ask people categorically whether or not a gluten-free diet helps alleviate some of their symptoms, most of our people that we surveyed said that a gluten-free diet either greatly or somewhat improved most of their symptoms. Nobody reported that a gluten-free diet worsened their symptoms, and I think that's important to highlight. But if you ask people to assign a number to how much symptom relief do you feel that they get, the majority of our survey respondents reported that they experienced very little to no symptom relief. The greatest majority responded somewhere in the middle, that they got some kind of symptom relief. But what I want to highlight is that this 25% symptom relief, or 11 to 25% symptom relief category, though it looks like a small number on this graph, I want you to kind of think about what a 25% improvement in your day would be like. That's like 15 minutes of every hour, feeling a little bit more awake, feeling a little bit more alert, getting one thing checked off your list. So we don't think that a 25% improvement, though it's a small number, we don't think it's insignificant in terms of improving symptoms. So we looked at people both with and without cataplexy to see if there were any differences in the way that people responded to a gluten-free diet. And what I want to highlight is that both people with and without cataplexy report some improvement. We do have people who report no improvement at all. The one thing that I want to point out about our survey is that we don't ask people how long they've tried a gluten-free diet. So if someone tried it for just a week or a few days or 2 weeks, we don't know if whether they maybe extended that elimination, if they might have felt better. However, I will say I do know people who have tried a gluten-free diet. They've tried many dietary options and their symptoms don't improve. So among people who report feeling better on a gluten-free diet, we then asked, how many times per week do you consume gluten? And we asked it in two ways. We asked them to assign a numerical value, and we also asked them to self-assign whether they felt they were careful or if they were very strict with their diet. And what you can see here is that both with and without cataplexy, the people who were the most strict, that is either zero gluten intake here, or they identified as strict, had a higher percentage symptom relief, as well as a higher categorical symptom relief that was significant compared to people who felt gluten-free made a difference, but continued to eat gluten 5 or more times per week. So I want to take the last couple of minutes to look at this category of people that we identified as high responders, and we identified these as people who responded 50% more to their dietary changes. What we found from this high responder population is that nobody achieves it by doing a gluten-free diet by themselves. So most of the people here couple it with a sugar-free or low-carbohydrate ketogenic diet. And this is really in agreement with that previously published literature I showed you. And we also know that sugar directly inhibits orexin production from neurons. So this highlights the idea that gluten-free is going to be one piece of the puzzle for many people. There's this avoidance of sugars, grains, seed oils, and alcohols. We know now that a standard gluten-free diet contains many processed foods and things that we now link to this leaky gut, and they contain inflammatory properties. And many people in our group, I also, again, want to highlight, use this in combination with medication. So I'm going to breeze through the last couple of these. We are going to have kind of a Q&A afterwards, and I think we've been given permission to have this room. So if you want to stay and talk about some more of this stuff in detail, please feel free to do that. So a ketogenic diet is a very, very strict version of the Atkins diet. It's a high fat, low carbohydrate diet, and it promotes the body to use ketones for fuel rather than glucose. And I know what you're thinking, high fat is really bad because you gain weight on high fat. I've been on a ketogenic diet for 5 years, and I lost 35 pounds on it. This is quite common. I also had poor cholesterol prior to going gluten-free, and I have normal cholesterol levels now on a high-fat diet. We've traditionally seen these in patients. It's recommended for intractable epilepsy. This particular paper recommends it for use in a variety of neurologic diseases, including narcolepsy. We know that the benefits of a low-carbohydrate ketogenic diet are direct because we know that there's positive benefits from burning ketones and using ketones as fuel. I also want to highlight out that a low-carbohydrate ketogenic diet increases non-REM and slow-wave sleep, and it also reduces REM, and so it has direct effects on sleep architecture. So many people do a paleo diet in our group. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. It's inherently gluten-free, but it's quite more strict. So it also avoids dairy, a lot of the processed and high carbohydrate foods, and it can be low carbohydrate. There's a modification of the paleo diet called the Walls Protocol, and Dr. Walls is a physician that was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and she developed a program called the Walls Protocol that took the basic tenets of paleo but added many dietary recommendations to enhance specifically neurologic functioning and neurologic repair after damage. And she's now actually in phase 3 clinical trials with a group of multiple sclerosis patients showing that this protocol does work in people with multiple sclerosis. I'm going to skip the FODMAPs food. What I want to say, if you're interested in it, we can talk about it later. What I do want to say about it is that all of the sort of foods that many of the people in our group have identified fall on a high FODMAP list of foods, and this is something we're just beginning to talk about in our groups, whether or not this would be beneficial. So in my opinion, if you tried to do all of these things, it would take you, 6 months to a year to identify one specific food. There are a few programs out now that incorporate sort of all of the major groups of inflammatory foods, including gluten, that can help determine individual food sensitivities on a very short period of time. The people in our group specifically use this particular protocol. So this is the summary. Basically, that many people with narcolepsy attempt dietary changes. The most common is a gluten-free diet, and we report varying degrees of symptom relief. So some people have a lot of improvement while others may not have any at all. But the people who tend to report a large amount or a high percentage of improvement that they have self-identified tend to couple it with a low carbohydrate or paleo diet. So I want to thank you very, very much. By show of hands, how many people from our gluten-free PWN Facebook group are in the room? Wow. That's awesome. That's double what I thought. So I want to especially invite you guys to stay. I think they've let us kind of run over into lunch to do an informal Q&A.
Is there any way for us to get, because you give us such great information on us?
Yes. So I have all the references to the talk on my website here at CLGraves / So I linked to all of the specific programs that are in the talk. Yeah. And definitely if you're on Facebook, please feel free to join us. Yes?
I have a question. I read recently of a case where a lady had celiac disease or sensitivity. She visited softener gluten, and they gluten-free, gluten wheat on there.
Yes. So this
is there something to emphasize GMOs, etc.?
There's conflicting evidence. So I think from a professional standpoint, the evidence for there being a genetically modified sort of contribution is low. There are a few papers that specifically look at the contribution of glycophosphate and how they affect the intestine that I think are scientifically credible. The best that I've heard is that sort of the breed of wheat that we have in the United States tends to be dramatically higher in gluten naturally than some of the other wheats that occur around the world. So I have a few friends that can eat einkorn wheat, for example, and it's thought that maybe it's naturally lower in gluten, and it's also not as processed as we tend to process in the United States.
Yeah, Christina, I was in Jordan for a week, which is, third world country.
Yeah.
And I had no trouble with food at all.
Yeah.
It really freaked me out.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah.
One thing you mentioned was the intestine relation. I had a rough life yesterday, and I happened to my intestine, and shortly after that, I was diagnosed with narcolepsy.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you started going on how that I'm having a 15 kind of trigger.
Yeah, I don't know of a good answer to that question. I haven't heard of anybody else in our group talk about that. But that short woman with red hair over there, she knows a lot about bypass more than I do. But I think it's a really interesting